So welcome to Leadership Within. And this is the moment for leaders to think about their human experience of leadership. So I'm Vanessa and I'm joined by TK.
Yes, myself, TK, that's me. You can see we always do these podcasts with a smile, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed I had this part that's going, did I do that right?
But does it matter? That's the real question, isn't it, Vanessa?
Exactly.
It probably doesn't, right? As long as our listeners enjoy it, as long as they enjoy our spontaneity and the smile, even though they can't see us.
So today we wanted to talk about self-worth and self-esteem and the impact of that on leadership. Like, what's it all got to do with leadership? And the idea is behind, I don't know, who knows, right? But the idea behind it is that if we, really acknowledge who we are and maybe some of the wounds that we have that we maybe haven't healed, that it actually is part of our leadership development. It's a foundational piece that helps us to really show up fully as leaders.
I definitely agree. Although, even though it's quite easy to say that, I'm sure that, as a listener, if you're listening to it, you think, oh my Lord, healing wounds and so on. And, these are big words. And you might think that there are no wounds, but there might be scratches that influence your leadership.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe a really lovely place to start, really, because I totally get what you're saying. Like, if you walk around saying, I'm wounded, it also sounds a little bit like I'm broken. There's something wrong with me. And so just to give a kind of reflection on this, for me, the piece around wounds is to say that, we're all shaped by, our experiences in early life. And, I've just come off a development program with a group of amazing women, all of whom, or many of whom, carry certain things inside them, certain thoughts, certain mindsets that come from a challenge when they were growing up, potentially. So, for example, someone is bullied in school, or someone really struggles to find their place in a school system. And that then has them, because they don't like that feeling, that then has them hustle unconsciously, to prove themselves. And I think often in leadership, we can have this unconscious driver that until we become conscious about it, it pushes us and others and can be quite relentless.
And I think, it's something that can easily be seen. But the interesting thing for me is, can easily be seen once you reflect on yourself as a leader, once you maybe look at other people that you've looked up to lead and think about what might have shaped them. It isn't always a wound. It isn't always trauma. But you're right in a way that, our early experiences shape us. But I would go wider than that. It's not only our childhood that shapes us, but, we develop all our lives. And I think the early experiences, maybe of our first job, maybe of our first boss, we're both leadership circle practitioners, and there's like this method there where you talk about your leadership journey. They can also be a huge influencer. And you're right, if there's an unmet need, it will show up in everything you do. And leadership is a demanding activity from our inner selves, and it will definitely be showing up there.
So I'm really curious about when you said an unmet need, and I'm just wondering whether you might share something around that to help us make sense of what that might look like in reality.
Of course. I think, to be absolutely honest, when it comes to childhood and the way we're being brought up, sometimes later in life we learn, or early in life actually, we learn to not to see it, to forget it. I'm not saying I had any difficulties in childhood that I probably did, but maybe I'm not reflecting on them that much. But there's one story I wanted to say, and it wasn't when I was a child. I was actually a young adult, and it was one of my early jobs. And back then, I've been a manager in a technical department. I worked in IT, and I've been asked to come with a salesperson onto a sales call with an association of medical doctors. I remember I was stressed, as one obviously can be. I don't think I did a great job. I talked too much. Possibly didn't listen. I definitely didn't listen. I possibly weren't open to what the doctor needed. But then again, maybe it's the way I reacted to stress. What's interesting is after the conversation, the salesperson, he wasn't angry at all, even though I think I've wasted his opportunity for a deal. However, he said, "Oh, you're very good technically, but when it comes to sales, I don't think it's the right job for you." And you know what, Vanessa? It really stayed with me for years, and it's been like 20 years since that time. This particular need, maybe for validation, for feeling like I've contributed, and this possibly harsh, even though not said in anger, statement has definitely been something that I've struggled with. And I definitely had to prove myself in sales, prove myself to myself that I can do it to overcome it. So that's the story I wanted to bring in.
And so I'm just a bit curious about that. What was it that you heard when he said, you're not built for sales? What was it that in your kind of interpretation that you heard?
Yeah, and I think that's a big question, and the answer is actually quite simple. You see, what I've heard, what actually got to my core was, I'll never be good in sales.
Okay.
Now that's a big statement that I have heard. Like I'll never be able to achieve it. There's a thing that I will not be able to overcome, and it really got to me because that's quite final, isn't it? Like with these things.
Yeah, for sure. It's like kind of that's it. It's a flat belief, then, isn't it? Like I can't.
It is, right? And I'm sure that many leaders, when they're developing whatever they do, they have these experiences, whether in their formational years or in their first jobs. We all have people that we look up to, even if they're not our bosses. At that time, he was a professional salesperson, and I thought he, knows his stuff. And I'm just reflecting on the fact how these kinds of experiences can shape us. But to be honest, Vanessa, it's not only that the negative ones have an influence, positive ones can have an influence too. So if he said, "Oh, TK, you're wonderfully talented in sales. I'm sure you'll be amazingly successful," like you could imagine a parent would say, well, I guess it would change my outlook for myself as a salesperson going forward.
But how would he do that if what he was seeing wasn't a kind of natural talent?
That's a good one, right? So this obviously goes to our role as leaders when it comes to delivering that, and
Right.
It's a good one, and I love the exploration, Vanessa. I'm thinking, how would if I were to go back in time and be near myself at this time, I would possibly say, "Hey, TK, well, this happened, right? How did you think you did? Would you like to reflect on that, right? Because I know you're a talented guy and you have so much great stuff to say. What do you think you'd improve in this conversation to make it more effective?"
Right.
Then again, it's like as a trained, certified, and experienced coach, it's easy to say this, but not everyone has this possibility to reflect like this, Vanessa, don't we?
Right. And so that's the difference, isn't it? What I'm hearing is, a judgment of you don't, you're not built for sales, versus a curiosity of how was that for you? What are you noticing? Like, so that you come to that, or to whatever conclusions that you come to on your own. So that leader as a coach rather than someone who is judging or assessing the situation.
But then again, as you can probably imagine, we can only be our best in a situation we're our best. So this particular leader, God bless him, the thing is, he wasn't probably that happy about a lost opportunity. And, he didn't speak in anger, so I'll give him that. And in fact, I don't think he even realizes how much of an impact he has had. It's just like a passing comment, maybe even with care. Maybe the fact that he said this, even judgmentally, was actually from a point of view of like, TK, focus on your strong suits, right?
Yeah, I hear you. And I'm noticing that a part of me um, is kind of feeling that you're being very kind in that moment, because it isn't our journey as leaders to be, intentional. And I think what you're making me
Mm,
think of is like the power of our word and the
yeah.
power of our word that is spoken without necessarily thought. And I'm not saying that every leader needs to lead from a place of constantly being, you know, conscious and intentional, because I think that's incredibly hard to do. But I'm wondering about, do we slow down enough and think about what is driving this conversation? What's important for this conversation? What's the outcome that we're hoping to get to from a conversation?
Well, I guess I would probably approach it differently because, hmm, interestingly, I've got a different analogy of like a tennis player. What people say, and I guess in any kind of sports, if you're thinking about it too much, you probably won't win. It has to be instinctual. And I guess, as I agree with you, to make sure that all conversations have a purpose, it's interesting how we try or how we get to it. What I would, however, postulate, Vanessa, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts, is maybe going a level higher and think about what is it about my values? What's what are the values that I always want to show up as I'm being a leader, and let me be guided by them. If it's care, how is it that I'm being caring? Am I being caring? Is it really my value? So that's how I always, when helping leaders, try to, talk about that. But I'm wondering what you think about this particular approach of value-based like behavior.
Yeah, well, you've got me thinking about, okay, so why did I want to have this conversation? Why
Hmm.
why did I, what was the point of talking about wounds and self-worth and being
Yeah.
self-aware as a leader? And I think yeah, it's really important to know our values and to come from that values-based leadership. Because to me, that's like your North Star. But I suppose the reason that I wanted us to explore a little bit around self-worth and
Hmm.
self-esteem is because I see, clients who show up in different places, like, um, you know, on the edge of burnout, because, they're driving themselves and their teams hard, because their organization is being, driven hard. Um, and I see people who suddenly might lose their job and not see that happen, that coming, or have a health challenge, or different things, and that for those that are very invested in their self-esteem is very invested in performance and who I am at work, the challenge that can be for them when things change. And so for me, it got me kind of curious between the difference between, okay, self-worth, like I'm worthy because of who I am, I've got an intrinsic value,
Yeah.
versus, self-esteem, which tends to probably be more performance-based or externally driven. And just how, why does this all matter in leadership? Because I think my assumption is that leaders with a strong sense of self-worth are going to be less reactive and more compassionate and resilient. Um, and then that is going to impact on their leadership effectiveness. I think that's the assumption that I'm kind of mulling over in my head.
That's an interesting one. But what I'm curious about, Vanessa, is what prompted this topic for you now? Is there a story
Yeah.
to share?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I mean, and I kind of, I'm really a bit aware that I don't want to. It's not my story. But I suppose I just came across somebody who was really struggling with their mental health, and part of that, obviously, life transitions had impacted it. You know, divorce, various other things, but also their ability to do their role because of a health challenge,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore having all of that taken away from them, and then them just going down a really dark rabbit hole of I'm not worthy because I'm not actually, you know, I don't have my status of being, you know, married. I've got a track record that's not very great in relationships. You know, and now the thing that I was most kind of adulated for, I no longer have. And that kind of like, that's a really tough place to be. And I suppose it just made me reflect on, you know, sometimes it is so easy to say, you know, look, hey, you're worthy because you're you and you're unique and you're brilliant and you're like, but actually, you know, in a world that is constantly kind of telling us that we're not enough, or, you know, marketing to us to sell products, you know, sometimes that's quite hard to get to hold on to. And I suppose I've seen it a number of times in working in the field of HR where, you know, people may be made redundant or whatever, but or have a disciplinary or whatever. But it's like, can we really connect to the human behind that process, and be caring in that process? I suppose that's part of what I was thinking, and I think the other aspect to it is seeing how we react when you know, we might be really controlling in our behaviors, for example, or we might drive perfection. You know, when we have got some kind of wounding that you know, at some point, you know, we've been mocked or felt embarrassed because, you know, we were seen to be not achieving or delivering or whatever. And actually how, you know, oh, I don't ever want to feel like that because it's shit. So I'm going to work, and I'm going to do everything I can to mask and to prevent me from feeling that feeling. So the willingness to be vulnerable is, you know, kind of reduced, I think, because God, if I'm not, you know, I've got to hold up this line of defense.
Yeah, it consumes a lot of energy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
Right?
does. It does, right? Rather than you know, what we say, which is so simple, isn't it? Which is, you know, we're all worthy, we're all learning. You know, we had a conversation earlier before we jumped on here about pivoting. You know, you're going to try something, then if it doesn't work, I'll pivot, and then I'll pivot again, and then I'll pivot, which is great. But what I see, and what I've also experienced in myself, is that if something doesn't work, like for example, in our own business, it is really tempting to go, oh, well, maybe I didn't have enough of this, or maybe I was, you know, like all that old crap comes up, and, you know, it can taint the data, which is really often quite simple, which is there a market for this?
Yes, absolutely. And you know what? We'll talk definitely about healing later on in this episode. But this, what it brings to my mind is the whenever we are being possibly touched by this itch, by this scar, by this wound, by this scratch, we get, or at least I see people getting, and even myself, when you know there's a soft spot, you get tunnel vision. You believe
Yes.
that it's all one dimensional, as you've said in the story that you've shared about relationships, right? Just because it was difficult to build a harmonious, productive, loving relationship, you might think that because this one dimension isn't currently going well, you might not be worth as much. But there are so
Right.
many dimensions, so many ways that a person is a wonderful being. You know what? The example you gave later on with pivoting and failure. Okay, well, the way I, for instance, deal with that is, and you know, it's maybe humorous, but I always say, well, now I can write a book about 101 ways to fail in business. Well, that's quite worthy, isn't it?
I love that because it kind of holds it really lightly, doesn't it?
Well, it does. Playfulness helps to get perspective. And as you can see, even you're laughing at that. But think about it, Vanessa. All our failures in life have taught us things. And if you think about that, well, as long as you're not repeating mistakes, or you can write a book about repeating mistakes, that's value, right? You have something to show for it. Even showing your scars can be impressive to people. I
Yeah.
mean, even things like that.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, okay, so how many people do you know that actually talk openly about their mistakes?
Oh, it's difficult to count, Vanessa. Not that many. Well, okay, a minority is able to do that. Just because, in my personal opinion, I don't think people enjoy being wrong or enjoy admitting to their mistakes because of natural, I think, cognitive dissonance. We'd like to think about ourselves as good people. We like to be competent, and reflection on our failure, well, unfortunately, might not agree with this image. It's important to confront that. It might be that, being raised and educated in a traditional education system, as I guess both of us were, we weren't necessarily encouraged in schools in our formative years to explore how we are wrong. It
Right.
wasn't necessarily about that, was it?
No, no. I remember when in the school that I went to, I used to hate this phrase. Oh my God. Tries hard, but like, like,
Yeah.
but in my school, they used to rank you numerically in the year. So it's just like, that's really, I mean, I'm laughing about it, but it's not a very pleasant thing. I mean, depending on what position you're in, right? Like,
After all these years, right? It's still there when you
yeah.
think about it.
Yeah. And how often are we doing that thing where we're going into a room and we're comparing?
Very often, I think. Maybe it's just a natural human behavior that's possibly not that productive, and yet, going against our human nature is difficult, especially in the modern day and age, which is all about consumptionism and, having and comparing so you can have more. I
Yeah.
mean, these are the times, and these are the times we're living in. So if this is the culture that's all around you, and the image of perfection is always there, screaming at you from all the orifices of social media and TV and whatnot, posters like the beach body and whatever it was. Still remember this one. Even if this one particular axis of your being, this one line, this one dimension, isn't necessarily comparable to this wonderful lady in the yellow swimsuit, you might think less of yourself. And why so? And then you have to go and be a leader, be the person that people are looking up to for leadership. How difficult it is.
Yeah. So where does that take us in terms of, like, where do we go from here? Because like we're kind of talking about, well, here's the challenge and here's the problem and
Yeah.
here's how we're shaped, and and here's what we can hold that can drive that kind of need to prove and try and perfect. But what's the connection between kind of leading with emotional intelligence? What's different?
In my mind, and I'd love to hear your opinion, is if you've got I won't say serious unmet needs, but I use this word, and I don't know what you think about this particular phrase, but for years I've been using insecure. If you're insecure about your self-worth, I feel for you. But the thing is, but I also feel for people that have to look up to people for leadership, and these leaders are insecure. It can be really hard because what can happen is subconsciously it might drive you to act out these insecurities on the people that need your support and care. I hope you're not doing that. And I hope even if you do, because you're just human, you want to improve. And this is why you're here listening to this podcast, because we've got some tips for you. Don't we, Vanessa?
Yeah. And I think the thing for me is, the difference between IQ being relatively fixed at what, 21, versus emotional intelligence. We can always learn and grow in this.
Well, the
And,
contemporary science about neurogenesis doesn't necessarily support this argument, but let's
doesn't it?
move on.
Tell me more.
Well, there's, how it goes with current medical knowledge and all the people having their own opinions. But talking to some people that study neuroscience, they currently believe that we can develop throughout our lives. Both of us, possibly close with what's the work of not Daniel Kahneman, but there's this guy that underpins the leadership circle. He talks about plateaus. It doesn't matter. I put his name in the podcast notes. But the thing is, we plateau in our lives, but it's not like we stop developing. And sometimes, even though when you're over 40, you can forget the name of a professor that you want to quote, it doesn't mean that you can't develop throughout your life in any kind of intelligence. And I think there's more than just IQ and EQ. But I guess it's a topic for another thing. But I don't know, Vanessa, have you seen people growing after the 20s in their intelligence? I have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say. I suppose the question is how you're measuring it. But, for me, I feel, whether it's, self-regard, impulsivity, interpersonal relationships, whatever aspect of emotional intelligence, like if we're open to it, we can really develop those skills. And I think sometimes, that's really underappreciated. And yet what we know is that, great leaders are emotionally regulated, or they can at least emotionally regulate. They can have healthy boundaries. They can, have a genuine confidence, fail fast, all those different qualities. So for me, I think the piece that I would want anyone who was listening to this to reflect on is just like, okay, so, if you feel like you are, reacting and, having to hold everything together and control or micromanage, or, if you've got aspects of that, then rather than make that wrong, it's like, oh, wow, that's such an invitation to look at, what's the belief underneath that, or what's the unmet need underneath that, and how might I give that to myself more skillfully? And I feel like, because it's not as simple as you've got self-worth or you've not. I think that's maybe a bit binary, but for me, there's this piece about, if I thought about when I did my leadership circle profile, one of the ones that was higher was passivity. And I was like, ugh, yuck, really don't like that. That's not how I like to think of myself. I'm a fire sign. I want to get things moving. The last thing I want to be is passive. And yet, the circumstance that I was in was one where I felt like I didn't have power. And it was, a survival strategy, better to stay safe, sit back, not say anything, do anything. And yet actually that was the thing that was most frustrating me, and also probably not getting me to where I wanted to get to. So then if I could pull that energy out of, instead of being passive, actually, setting some meaningful goals, and more of the achievement area, stepping into the vision and the courageous authenticity, then I've got some movement. But it was kind of just like a survival pattern at the time.
I just feel that I'm sorry that we had this, and it's every time that these kinds of difficult situations happen, it's just interesting to observe how our natural self gets overwhelmed by that, right? As you say, and it's Robert Keegan, by the way, and Lisa Leahy. Obviously, recording on a computer is helpful because you can find these references. But the interesting thing is, maybe to follow up on what you said, is you can only you can only apply strategies that I'm sure we'll mention in a bit when you're actually conscious that that's happening for you. The first step is always recognizing that there's something going on and something needs to, you might want to change something.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what are the signals that tell you there's something going on or you want to change something?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, Do you know what, Vanessa? That's one of my challenges. Like personally, I wouldn't necessarily say that I do struggle with self-esteem or self-worth. In fact, I might even say I have the opposite. I'm not a narcissist, and not you can't see me in Donald Trump and such. It's not that. A true test for a narcissist is probably to ask a narcissist if there are one. But I'm somehow managed to always find some value within myself and persevere. Now, the challenge with that is that it got me to be blind for some silly decisions I might be making, or my own behavior, or you know, maybe I've been trusting myself too much, not necessarily observing the obvious signs there were. Now, leading a business is definitely something that exposes it. It's definitely something that in employment you think you can get by, and you do, but when running a business, you have to be more open to being wrong. And for me, the problem is I can't see it when it happens, but I see the results. And it possibly, even though I'm sure that many of our listeners would like to say, oh, TK, this is so great. I would love to be able to constantly feel valued and energetic and so on. But there's always a shadow side. And for me, it's like saying, stop. Now, what is it that you're not thinking about? Now, what's the SWOT analysis? And by which I mean risks and threats. It's a bit of a difficult one. So it's a difficult answer and a difficult question for me. But Vanessa, it might be something that you can see a bit more.
Well, so it's really interesting because as you're talking, I'm noticing, and I'm curious about whether part of this conversation is a difference in our gender. Because it's just front of mind. Having just come out of a women's workshop, just how men, will often put themselves forward when they've got, a lot less of the criteria than women, women feeling they need to have a lot more, how men will reach out to their network and ask for help, whereas women are less likely to do that. What's in my head and is noodling away there is like, I wonder if there's a difference in gender here, but also I'm wondering if there's a difference in what you're describing seems like a really thoughtful, logical process. And how is that different for someone that is maybe coming from a feelings, intuitive orientated kind of process? That's what's
Very
going on
interesting
in full
points. No.
transparency.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can only respond with my own transparency, with the fact that even though obviously, in my personal opinion, there's so much going on in this particular area, I don't like to say, gender. And so I don't like to necessarily say that because it's your gender, it's your skin color, it's your upbringing, you are not able or allowed to do something. I do not believe that it is a limiting factor. There's obviously differences for obvious reasons, but I always believe that a lot of it is social conditioning, sadly.
Yeah.
Sadly, because, it's not always positive, right? We can't be ourselves, who we are, and we are our own brilliant selves. So that's one thing. And, I think there's so much social conditioning when it comes to gender, race, culture, religion. I'm not necessarily that fond of it myself. That's thing number one. Thing number two is it's interesting because maybe I've got a bit of a preference towards this rational thinking. And what you might find a bit of a surprise is because of that, my emotional intelligence is actually based on it. And it's a really weird thing for people to notice and interact with, how because I haven't necessarily been investing much in the proper empathy, my emotional intelligence is it's there, it serves me well, and I've developed it quite a bit, but in an interesting way that's a bit rational, even though I'm fully aware and embracing the irrational aspect of it, but in a rational way. People find it strange.
Oh, I love your candor. I mean, I find this conversation quite intriguing, and what I'm noticing is, um, so my blind spot can be empathy can overwhelm me, right? And I can just be so feeling everything that I'm like, where am I in it all? And I've had to really learn that thing around boundaries and and emotional regulation. Um, but what I'm, and so I'm listening to you and I'm valuing the logic reasoning that you're bringing, and I'm just noticing the differences, right? And it's like I feel like that's so much of, if we were talking about anything with this work, it is about how do we embrace differences more and see the value in it. And I suppose I just feel like this conversation is actually doing it. We are, we're recognizing, gosh, there's some differences here. You might have, healthier esteem than perhaps I might have in certain situations, because I carry a limiting belief around, what would I say my limiting, just the need to prove myself, probably, prove myself enough. And whereas you don't come from that place. So therefore that we're coming from a different starting point, and then just being aware of that and then saying, oh, wow, how might that affect how you lead? You know, for me, I'm very conscious of how that might affect how I lead. And I do the work to not, try my hardest to not act that out. Or when I do, to repair. But what I'm hearing you say is that's not part of your challenge.
Well, first of all, when I say I wanted to acknowledge how, your limiting belief was escaping you, right? The limiting beliefs we have always try to slip our mind and bury deep inside us. It's not that I don't have it. And, I think the story I've shared at the beginning proves that I do. It's only a question of circumstances that challenge you enough. As you said yourself, Vanessa, when it comes to like the leadership circle model even, but any model would have that if you're in a place that really stresses you out, that really pushes you towards the boundary, everything breaks. And we can show stuff that normally isn't in us, right? I've had situations, and okay, fine, I can joke about writing a book about 101 ways to fail in business, but having to confront myself with a label of a, failed business owner or fall from a high horse isn't always easy in different ways, right? So the fact that I managed to pick myself up might be only a facade of sorts. That's what I'm telling myself. The question is, what will happen if we talk a year from now? If I, for instance, fail again, what will be the conversation be then? Even though I can logically talk about that and not necessarily feel it at that time. The only thing is it productive? Is it helping me? I am envious of the fact that you're feeling it. I know it comes with a burden of being, constantly exposed to this fire of empathy. And yet it probably gives you so much.
That's an interesting perspective. Yeah, I think it probably, I think it gives me a depth of feeling and connection. That is something that I have a need around.
And, enhances the way you lead, right? We do lead differently. Like if you look at my profile, obviously, like you've got protective, but also authenticity. And this is the beauty of, well, we're talking about this model constantly, but any kind of differences, as you say, that, impact the way you do it, but it can all be productive, valuable, and wonderful. Let's just embrace it.
I think it's that. It's the alchemy, isn't it? Of like, God, if we can look at the bits that perhaps have shaped us in a way that has made us protect ourselves, and turn those, turn that energy and alchemize that energy into something really creative, and it's like gold dust, isn't it? It's like, wow, I can actually, it's a lot easier, it's a lot more joyful in the way that we lead. It's more agile. It's all those things. So I'm wondering
those things,
and I'm wondering if that's a nice kind of place to segue and just say, so what would we, so anyone listening to this, kind of rambling conversation, what would we say were the practical kind of things that we'd want people to take away from it?
Well, okay. So as a person that always reacts positively to when someone says, take away something practical, I might speak. What I think is important in my mind, what I would love you, dear listener, to take away from that is like, well, it's important to know that I'm sure you have a limiting belief or two. And it's okay to say it out loud, even to yourself, because that's the first step of healing. We might not be perfect. No one is. But I think there's so many ways we can work with that. But our first step is always noticing and acknowledging, isn't it? Vanessa, what would you say that you're
Yeah,
taking away here?
totally. Yeah, and I think once we have acknowledged those, then we can start to question them. Like, is that true? Has it always been true? What else might be true? We can start to then flip them over into more empowering beliefs that actually really support where we want to go. And as much as I used to really hate affirmations because I really, God, when I was much younger, it was like, you have the right to speak up. It was very that the language of them I didn't like. And I didn't like the idea that you would be given something in someone else's words to say to yourself. But I actually think if you take something like a limiting belief and you flip it and you say, well, what would be the opposite of that? What else would be true? And you find your flavor with that, your way that feels really authentic for you, and you start to
Mm,
reinforce that. I think it really, it supports your growth, and the more that we reinforce and affirm to ourselves our intrinsic value, then the more liberated we are from those limiting beliefs.
absolutely. And, if I might put a twist on it, what can work for you is something that works for me, which is journaling it. It's
Mm.
interesting that when, I got into a, let's say, difficult spot and I started possibly doubting the path that I put myself on, while journaling, I switched to this you language and I spoke to myself in these words, writing them down. Because, it depends how you think. But for me, it's easy to discount the thoughts in my head. But if they're on paper, if I read them, if I wrote them, there's a permanence about them. There's tangibility, an important thing for many people, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think the other thing for me is just who are you surrounding yourself with? Are you
Mm,
surrounding yourself with people, where you can show up, you can share, that they genuinely, your network really genuinely supports you and lifts you. It's that whole thing of it takes a village, isn't it, to raise an
it does.
entrepreneur or to raise a child? But, it's so true, right? You know,
It is. And even if you're not the most outgoing person in the world, even if you find it hard to ask people to help you to be your villagers, your tribe, even if you feel alone, there's always us in this podcast. Even though we can't see you, we can't hear you, we think that you might be reflecting on these things as you're listening to this episode, and we're here for you.
love that. Thank you, TK. I'm wondering if that's a really nice place for us to just complete on this conversation.
Yes, yes. As we're going to the time of the holidays, it's important for people to reflect. And thank you so much, Vanessa, for bringing this topic in. I hope we will obviously meet again soon. And our listeners, I hope that you'll come back to us.